Happy Easter and welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we are launching a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California this fall, 2021. While waiting for LA County to reopen, we launched online. So this is it. You're here, Sola Church Online. If you're watching on the Church Online platform, you can click invite in the chat feed to ask someone to join you.
And if you're watching on Facebook, you can share this to your timeline.
If you watch later on YouTube, be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any new content coming from Sola Church.
And Alan, what would you say to those who are wanting to learn more about our in-person launch, or maybe even wanting to get involved?
Yeah, so it's all about the startup parties. We've got a couple coming up soon, more after that, but the ones that are scheduled right now, Sunday, April 18th, and then we'll do another one on Wednesday, May 5th. So keep those dates in mind. We're going to talk more about the startup parties a little bit later in the service, but first, tell us about worship today. What's the plan for that?
Well, we are going to do some worship this morning, but I'm also going to share an original song called Faithful that's off of my worship album, Adore.
Awesome. Can't wait for that. Let's worship.
picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. When I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. And when I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my Hallelujah, save me, so much better your way. And all I did was praise. All I need to do is worship. Lord, I will just bow down. No, I'm just gonna stay still. When I think of the cross and how much it cost for you to save me, I know all that I have could never repay the gift that you gave me. But you held out your hand, you welcomed me in, and that's how you showed me you are faithful, so faithful. Your love's never changing, your promise unfailing, your mercy is always the same. You are faithful, so faithful. You're faithful to me. When I look at myself, ashamed of my sin, weak and imperfect, and yet cleansed by your blood, covered by grace, though I don't deserve it. And you held out your hand, you welcomed me in, and that's how you showed me you are faithful, so faithful. Your love's never changing, your promise Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives, and life is worth the living just because he lives.
So this is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. To all of our virtual guests, we're so glad that you're with us today. Please don't feel obligated to participate in this. But for those of us that consider Sola Church our church home, this is a very meaningful part of our service. So you'll see a link there in the chat feed. You can always go to our website, solachurch.life, and click Give. And there you can make a one-time gift or schedule a recurring gift. For those who prefer to give on PayPal, the email address that you'll need for that is give@solachurch.life. As always, we are so grateful to you for your support. It's making it possible for us to do church online each week.
Right.
And it's also making it possible for us to save up for that investment that we're going to make when we launch in person in the fall.
Speaking of launching in person, we were going to talk more about the startup parties that are coming up.
Yeah, that's right. So these are virtual events. They are fast, fun, 60-minute Zoom meetings. I mean, we have food delivered to your door. We've got games and giveaways. There are video elements. Near the end, we share our vision for Sola Church, and everyone has the opportunity to fill out a digital response card indicating, their interest going forward. So once again, the next couple startup parties are scheduled for Sunday, April 18th at 4 p.m. And then the next one is Wednesday, May 5th at 6:30 p.m. So yeah.
Right, and to register for the startup party, you're going to go to www.solachurch.life, click Startup Party, and then choose your date. And with that, let's get into our time of teaching.
So let's turn in our Bible to two places. The first place is John chapter 19. If you'll save that spot with something, your finger, a business card, whatever's handy. Then turn to Luke chapter 23. So no doubt many of you are familiar with Twitter. And if you're on Twitter, I would love it if you would go to @SolaChurchLA and give us a follow. But there are something like 500 million tweets that go out every single day. About 80% of those from people's mobile phones. And sometimes people live tweet an event. Like they might be at an event, and so as things are happening, they're using the hashtag live tweet, and they're telling everybody what's going on. Imagine if someone had been live tweeting from Calvary, if they'd been live tweeting from the site of the crucifixion. That's kind of the idea in our message today. We're talking about live tweets from Calvary, the 7 things that Jesus said from the cross as if they had been live tweeted. So look with me at Luke 23, beginning in verse 33. It says that when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. And then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. You know, the cross has been called the most famous and popular symbol in all of history. We see it in art, both religious and sacrilegious. We see it in body art. You should Google sometime celebrities with cross tattoos. You'll be amazed at how many come up and at who comes up. Even in performance art, artists from Madonna to Marilyn Manson have used crosses as part of their concerts. But crucifixion, it was invented by the Persians, but perfected by the Romans. In fact, the ancient Jewish historian Josephus called crucifixion, quote, the most wretched of deaths, end quote. In fact, in the 4th century, it was abolished throughout the Roman Empire by the Emperor Constantine. C.S. Lewis wrote that the crucifixion did not become a frequent motive of Christian art until the generations which had seen real crucifixions were all dead. And so they brought Jesus to the place called Calvary, as it says in verse 33. Calvary actually means a skull. So that's kind of cool. Like our sending church, Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, is really Skull Chapel, Costa Mesa. How cool is that? Think of how many cities have a First Baptist church in that city. And then think of how many cities have a Calvary Baptist church in that city. How cool would that be? Where do you go to church? Skull Baptist. I love it. Well, in verse 33 it says, there they crucified him. So his hands were nailed through the wrists to a horizontal beam, and then that beam was hoisted and attached to a vertical beam, likely dislocating the shoulders of the victim. Then the feet would be nailed through the heels to the vertical beam. This whole experience was so unspeakably awful that they actually invented a new word to describe it. The word excruciating literally means out of the cross. These crucifixions were nothing like the secretive executions carried out today. They wanted to make an example of someone. They wanted to send a message. And so victims were suspended between heaven and earth, not unlike a scarecrow. And though when we depict the crucifixion of Jesus, we depict him wearing a loincloth, it's likely that he was in fact naked. These victims would be incontinent, so we can only begin to imagine the embarrassment, the humiliation, and the shame. And with that, if we were there in the 1st century and if someone were live tweeting from the scene, we would have a notification. The first tweet would come in, and it would tell us that Jesus had spoken and said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. You see those words there in verse 33. Now, clearly this was a prayer. So of the 7 tweets, the 7 times that Jesus spoke from the cross, 3 of them, the first, middle, and last, were prayers. It's worth noting that Jesus didn't pray for himself. He didn't even pray for family members or friends who were present, but he prayed for his enemies, including the soldiers who had just crucified him. And he didn't pray forget them or even get them, but he prayed forgive them. In fact, he said that they did not know what they were doing in verse 34. What didn't they know? Well, they didn't understand the enormity of what they were doing. This was not just a homicide, it was deicide. Jesus was not just a man or even just a good man, but the God-man. He was God with skin. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 8, had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. How amazing is it that Jesus prays what he does for them? We are those who cut each other no slack, and here's Jesus cutting so much slack. This teaches us about forgiveness, doesn't it? It teaches us that anyone can forgive and that anything can be forgiven. Anyone can forgive? Well, sometimes we say, I can't forgive. I was innocent. Well, no one was as innocent as Jesus. Anything can be forgiven. Sometimes we say, well, I can't forgive that, they're totally guilty, but no one was ever as guilty as those for whom Jesus prayed. And so continuing on, picking it up right where we left off, in verse 34 it says, and they divided his garments and cast lots, and the people stood looking on. But even the rulers with them sneered, saying, he saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. The soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. And an inscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, this is the king of the Jews. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And so they rolled dice for Jesus' personal belongings, and then the verbal abuse began. It tells us in verse 35 that the rulers sneered. In verse 36 that the soldiers mocked. And in verse 39 that the criminals blasphemed. And so I want to talk about how Jesus actually died on another man's cross. In verse 33, we see that there was a criminal on either side of him, but all the way back in verse 18, we see that another criminal was released. That was Barabbas. And so Jesus almost certainly took the place of Barabbas, but more importantly, Jesus took the place of each and every one of us. He was probably literally hanging on Barabbas's cross, and these criminals on either side of him were almost certainly Barabbas's partners in crime. Jesus was called the friend of sinners in a couple different places in the Gospels. That's a good thing if that's how you see yourself. If you realize that nobody's perfect, that you're not perfect, that you need to be forgiven. So as in life, so in death, Jesus was the friend of sinners. Now, Matthew and Mark tell us that both criminals blasphemed Jesus, but in verse 39, here in Luke, it tells us that one blasphemed. Is that a contradiction in the Bible? Actually, no, it's a conversion. And so once again, we've got a notification on our phones. The second live tweet is coming from the scene. It's coming from Calvary. And we're learning that Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise, verse 43. So if this was a conversion, how did it happen and when? Well, we read moments ago about the sign over Jesus' head. It was recorded in 3 languages, Greek for philosophy, Latin for law, and Hebrew for religion. What Jesus did on the cross, he did for the whole world. It's funny because it said that he was the king of the Jews on the sign, but, well, he looked like anything but a king at this moment. But this criminal who converted, he believed it. And when he heard the prayer on Jesus' lips, forgive them, he received it. It's so amazing to me that there were 2 men. One trusted and was saved. The other didn't and was lost. There's a lot of people that are like, I'll get religion when I get old. For them, this criminal is basically the patron saint for play now, pray later. But it's important to remember that this man didn't wait for his last opportunity to follow Christ. He took advantage of his first. And so as we continue, save your place here in Luke because we're going to come back to it. But turn over to your place in John. We're going to continue in John chapter 19 in verse 26. Where it says, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. So in addition to Jesus' enemies who were at the cross, well, there were family members, his mom and aunt, and there were friends, including John, also known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That is so rock star. Like I think about Marshall Mathers, whose stage name is Eminem, whose alter ego is Slim Shady. I mean, John was like that. In the Gospel of John, he's the disciple whom Jesus loved. In 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, he's known as the elder. And then in the book of Revelation, he's just John. In heaven, who knows? Who knows what he's come up with? But now we've got another notification on our phones. The third tweet coming from Calvary. We learned that Jesus said to Mary, "Woman, behold your son," there in verse 26. Now, addressing her as woman doesn't sound good to us, but actually the word that Jesus used was a title of respect. And when he said, "Behold your son," he wasn't referring to himself. He was referring to John. John was to take Jesus' place as Mary's earthly caregiver. In some sense, Calvary was a place of reward for Mary. Don't get me wrong, it was a place of excruciating pain for Mary. A different kind of pain, perhaps, than the pain that Jesus was experiencing, but a place of pain nonetheless. But it was also, in some sense, a place of reward. Mary had been a wonderful mother, and Jesus rewarded her by making sure that her needs would be met. But this third live tweet tells us, too, that Jesus spoke to John and said, "Behold your mother," in verse 27. So if for Mary, the cross was a place of reward, for John it was a place of responsibility. You know, why didn't Jesus entrust the care of his mother to Joseph or to his brothers? Well, it's believed that by this time Mary was a widow. Joseph had passed. And Jesus' brothers, well, they didn't believe in him. And the fact that they would come to believe in him afterward is one of many evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. But this responsibility was given to John. And so the cross, well, it's a place of responsibility for all of us. It's a reminder that we're all to live for him and to look after others. And so turning back to our place in Luke, we want to pick it up in verse 44. It says, "Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour." And so at this point, we have 3 hours of darkness. And so our phones go off. We've got another notification. The 4th tweet, we learned that at this point, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now we actually read those words in Matthew and in Mark. But when Jesus prayed that prayer, he was quoting from the Old Testament. He was quoting from Psalm 22, verse 1. It's interesting that this is the only time Jesus asks God the Father a question, but clearly Jesus at this moment was feeling abandoned. He was feeling forsaken. What was actually happening here in the darkness? You know, both literally and metaphorically. Jesus was going from being sinless to being sinful. He became our sin. He was made to be the worst of what we are. This is what Luther called the great exchange. Jesus was exchanging his perfection for our imperfection, his obedience for our disobedience, his intimacy with the Father for our distance from the Father, his blessing for our cursing, his life for our death. Have you ever had an unexplainable sense of loneliness? You know, even while standing in the middle of a crowd, sometimes especially in the middle of a crowd. You know, so many of us have come from broken homes or been part of a blended family. So many of us have experienced divorce. We've experienced abuse. We've experienced neglect. You know, maybe you carry with you these feelings of abandonment. It's no wonder that this has been called a generation alone. And then you add to that a year spent in lockdown, you know. Some of you maybe not as impacted as those of us living in Southern California, but for a lot of us, we have family members that we may not have seen for a year or more because of this. And so we're dealing with these feelings. But Jesus felt that. You know, Jesus felt forsaken so that we could know that we need never be forsaken by God. So I love that he took our place even in that sense and addresses even those kinds of feelings that we may be having. And so now we've got to turn back to John as we continue in John 19. In verse 28, it says, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it to his mouth. And so again, we have a notification on our phones. Here comes another live tweet from Calvary. We learned that Jesus said, I thirst, verse 28. This was a fulfillment of Psalm 22, verse 15. So we have these 7 sayings. We've got the one in the middle, but then we got the 3 that came before it, the 3 that come after it. So the first 3, they took place over 3 hours. These last 3, they come rapid fire, one after the other, after the other. This was the only time that Jesus referred to his own physical need. Up until now, he'd spoken about a murderer's forgiveness, about a man's salvation, about his mother's care. This is so counterintuitive, isn't it? When we're hurting physically or even emotionally, we tend to think more about ourselves and less about others. But Jesus thought less about himself and more about others. And how different would our lives be if, when we're suffering, if we could find a way to not just become so completely self-absorbed that we shut others out. I can't help but think, as we think about thirst, about Jesus' words, sometime before this, recorded all the way back in John chapter 4. Jesus said to a woman at a well, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. That's so true. No matter what you drink, you will thirst again. I love me some Diet Coke, now and again a sugar-free Red Bull. I love me some Starbucks espresso. I had some on the way here today. That's like the holy trinity of caffeine right there. But I can drink that stuff and I'm still just going to be thirsty again. Sometimes even more thirsty than I was before I drank it. Our body cravings are never fully or finally satisfied. And you know what? Our soul cravings and our spirit cravings are never fully or finally satisfied without God. In that same conversation with that woman at the well, Jesus went on to say, whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. Jesus wasn't schlepping bottled water. He was talking about what he had to offer. It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? But it is true nonetheless that our soul cravings and our spirit cravings are fully and finally satisfied with God. In life, when you get the thing you wanted and you're still not satisfied, you know that wasn't what you really wanted. And underneath all of our desires, our greatest desire and our greatest need is for God himself. So, continuing then, here in John, at the beginning of verse 30, it says, so when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And so we've got another notification on our phone. Here comes the 6th live tweet from Calvary. We learned that Jesus said, it is finished. He didn't say, I am finished. He said, it is finished. What was he talking about? Well, the law was finished in the sense that its just demands had been met in the life of Christ. The prophets were finished in the sense that all of the prophecies related to the first coming of the Messiah had been fulfilled by Jesus. Jesus' suffering was finished. Jesus' work, that is the work of salvation, was finished. The penalty of sin was finished. Potentially the power and ultimately the presence of sin in our lives was finished. And so what an amazing thing it is to realize that. The verb tense for this verb translated, it is finished, it's in the perfect tense, which means finished once and for all. There was nothing else that had to be done. There's nothing for you to do, nothing for me to do. There's no hoops for us to jump through. Jesus did everything that needs to be done for us to be forgiven. And how do we know he was right? How do we know that it really was finished? How do we know that there really is nothing else to be done? Well, among other things, because Jesus rose from the dead on that first Easter Sunday, because he later ascended into heaven, because after that, he sent the Holy Spirit. So there's this idea, that most people believe that good people go to heaven. Many people believe that religious people go to heaven, but the truth is it's forgiven people who go to heaven. That a right relationship with God isn't something that you work for, it's something that you receive as a gift. It is finished. And so as we turn back to our place in Luke, we pick it up there in verse 45 where it says, "Then the sun was darkened and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' And having said this, he breathed his last." And so once again, we've got a notification on our phone. There's a 7th live tweet coming to us from Calvary. Jesus said, we learn, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Now, it's interesting that there are a number of things here that Jesus commended or committed to others. His clothing to the soldiers, his mother to a friend, his body to one Joseph, but his spirit to his Father in heaven. It's been said that it was not death which approached Christ, but Christ's death. And what an amazing thing it is, this detail, don't miss it, about the veil being torn. When you talk about the Jewish temple, talk about the temple proper, you have the holy place. And then behind this great veil, the most holy place. Now, only one person, the high priest, could go into the holy place, and that only once a year on the Day of Atonement. Other priests couldn't go beyond the veil, and certainly ordinary people couldn't go beyond the veil. Matthew and Mark add the detail that not only is it true that when Jesus died, the veil was torn, but they add the detail that it was torn from top to bottom. Alfred Edersheim talks about the veil, as do others. Tacitus, Josephus, even in the Talmud, it talks about these things. But Alfred Edersheim tells us that the veil was 60 feet long. It was 30 feet wide. It was the thickness of the palm of the hand. It was made up of 72 squares and took 300 priests to manipulate. So that it was torn, and that it was torn from top to bottom, means that it was God that tore it. And when God tore that thing that stood between himself and all of humanity, he was declaring open house. He was inviting us to come as we are. There's one other thing I want to mention about this last live tweet. Jesus said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." This was actually a bedtime prayer. Jewish children were taught from an early age to pray this prayer before they went to sleep. With that in mind, it's not unlike bedtime prayers that we learned as children. Jesus, when the moment came for him to release his spirit, when the moment came for him to pass, Jesus essentially said, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." And with that, John tells us, he breathed his last. Now, this isn't the end of the story for Jesus. We've talked more about Good Friday than we have about Easter, haven't we? But on that first Easter Sunday morning, Jesus rose from the dead. He conquered sin and death. He was victorious. This wasn't the end for him. And Easter is a reminder that no matter what is going on in our lives, it's not the end for us either. So many of you know bits and pieces of our stories. How Miranda and I, we both went through divorces more than a decade ago now that our lives just completely fell apart. And, in my own case, as I reflect on, losing my marriage and my ministry and all of my material things and in the struggle that followed, there was a period of time where I just lost my way, a period of time where it was so hard for me to find a way forward, a period of time where it was so much easier to just post up at the sports bar and numb myself than it was to grieve the loss of almost everything, and in many cases, everyone I'd known. And I remember as God began doing a new thing in my life, I remember, I hadn't been attending any particular church consistently, and an Easter Sunday, several years back now, where I attended an Easter service with a friend, and as I sat in this arena filled with thousands of people singing these worship songs, it just hit me like a wave. The words to the song just pierced my heart, and I just broke. I just began to weep. Man, it was so hard. I just could not maintain my composure. I was struggling, didn't want my friend to see me crying, but I was just so emotional. And in fact, it would be months before I could sit through a church service, through the worship in particular, without just weeping. But it was like for the first time, I dared to let myself feel a little bit of that grief, a little bit of that hurt, a little bit of that pain. And it was overwhelming. That Easter Sunday was a reminder for me that it wasn't over for me. I hope that this Easter Sunday will be a reminder for you that it isn't over for you. For some of you, this might be the greatest time in your whole life. But for others of you, it's been a very difficult year. And for some of you, this may be one of the hardest, one of the darkest times in your whole life. And I just want you to know it's not over for you. Maybe you're out there today watching this service and you haven't really even taken that first step of trusting Jesus to forgive you and to lead you. When He died on that cross, He died for you. And we want to give you an opportunity to not only celebrate what He did in dying for you and in rising again, but to open your heart to Him today in a new way. He became the unforgiven that we might become the forgiven. Let's pray together right now. Father, I'm so thankful for you sending your Son and for what He did for us on the cross, and so thankful that He rose from the dead, that He's alive, that He's seated there at your right hand in heaven. And Lord, right now I'm just thinking about people who may feel like I felt on that Easter Sunday some years ago. Maybe they've just been stuffing all of the hurt in their life. Maybe there's just, a wall of grief, and maybe at this moment that wall is just sort of crashing over them. Maybe it's crashing over them even like a wave. And I just pray that in the midst of that, they could see the light shining through the darkness. I pray that they could see the hope piercing their despair. I pray that they could understand that it's not over for them, that, Lord, you love them and that you have a plan for them and that you can make something beautiful out of their lives no matter what they've done or what's been done to them. But Father, I pray too for anyone that hasn't taken that first step I talked about just a moment ago. They haven't asked you to forgive them. They haven't asked you to lead them. I pray that they would do that. I pray that they would say a simple prayer right now, even as I'm praying, that they would say a simple prayer, just acknowledging that they've sinned, because nobody's perfect, and asking you to forgive them, asking you to come into their life and to lead them, asking you for a new beginning, expressing to you their desire to live a new kind of life in a new kind of space. And Father, as they pray a prayer like that, I pray that they would just understand that what they're doing is they're receiving that free gift of salvation. And Lord, that they could, by faith, receive that. And Lord, that they would have that peace of knowing that they're forgiven and that joy of knowing that they're a new person in you. Father, I just commit everyone to you now and all these things to you now in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
And now it's time to fill out a connection card.
Yeah, as always, you'll see a link in the chat feed, but you can always go to our website, solachurch.life, and click Contact. That's where the connection card lives. That's your way of letting us know that you attended online today. we'll be able to keep you updated on everything that's going on with Sola Church. It's also where you can choose if you want to participate in one of our virtual small groups that meets each week, where we talk about the previous weekend message. There's a box you can click. There's also a box for those of you that are ready to join the launch team. If you're within driving distance of Santa Monica and you know already, even if you haven't attended a startup party, you know already that you want to be a part of that launch team, that you're going to attend on the weekend, that you want to be part of the team that makes it happen. You can actually join the launch team today. But for those of you that do want to register for one of those startup parties that we've been talking about throughout the service, be sure to go again to the website, solachurch.life, click Startup Party, and then choose your date, April 18th or May 5th. And there, of course, will be more dates coming.
Awesome. And we are starting a new series next week.
Yeah, that's right. I'm excited to talk about that. The new series is called Takedown. It's a 3-week series based on 1 Samuel 17, one of the great takedown stories in the Bible. This is David's takedown of the giant Goliath. And the truth is, we've all got giants in our lives. I mean,
Right.
think about our lives and some of the giants that we've faced, from abuse to abandonment, to divorce, to starting over midlife, to trying to plant a church in a pandemic. No one's ever done that before. So chances are that you've got a giant in your life, and we're going to be talking about how to take down those giants.
Can't wait. So we hope that you have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, happy Easter, everybody.